Mrs. Thomas Beresford, better known as Tuppence, lounged on the divan with a restlessness that could rival a caged bird. Her gaze wandered out the window, though the view offered little inspiration. Just another block of flats staring back like a dull mirror. She sighed, the kind of sigh that speaks volumes about boredom, and then, almost theatrically, yawned. "I wish," she said, with the weight of unspoken dreams behind her words, "something would happen." Tommy, her ever-practical husband, looked up from his chair, eyebrows raised in mock disapproval. "Careful, Tuppence. This craving for vulgar excitement is beneath you," he chided. But Tuppence was in no mood for reproach. She closed her eyes and let her imagination drift. "Tommy and Tuppence were married," she began in a sing-song voice, "and they lived happily ever after. And 6 years later, they're still here, stuck in their happily ever after." Her tone carried a hint of irony, and when she opened her eyes again, there was a spark of rebellion in them. "It's extraordinary, isn't it? Life never turns out the way you think it will." Tommy smirked. "A profound observation, my dear, but hardly original. Poets and philosophers have beaten you to it, and done it with a bit more finesse." But Tuppence was undeterred. "6 years ago," she continued, "I thought life would be a grand, sweet song. With you by my side and a little money to buy whatever we wanted, I was sure we'd be dancing through life. But now I don't even notice the music anymore." "Is it me or the money that's lost its charm?" Tommy asked, feigning injury. "It's neither," Tuppence replied with a teasing smile. "It's just, I've grown used to my blessings, the way you don't think about breathing through your nose until you've got a cold." And there it was, the crux of her discontent. Tuppence didn't want luxury or stability. She wanted chaos, excitement, a spark to ignite the monotony of daily life. She wanted the kind of adventure where strangers stagger into rooms with cryptic warnings, or dark mysteries unravel in the dead of night. But for now, all she had was the quiet hum of a life too perfect, too predictable, and far too dull. "If I had something better to do, I suppose I ought to take up good works," mused Tuppence, her voice tinged with a mix of mockery and desperation. Then, leaning forward with a sudden burst of enthusiasm, she exclaimed, "Oh, Tommy! I do wish something exciting would happen. I know, it would do us good. Shake us out of this dreary routine." Tommy, ever the composed counterpart to Tuppence's fervor, raised an eyebrow. "Curious you should say that," he remarked, rising from his chair and strolling toward the writing table. Opening a drawer, he retrieved a small photograph and handed it to her. Tuppence's eyes lit up. "Oh, you've got them developed. Is this the one you took of the room, or the one I did?" "Mine," Tommy replied smugly. "Yours didn't come out. Underexposed it, again, you always do." Tuppence gave him a look that was half playful, half indignant. "How lovely for you, Tommy, to think there's at least one thing you can do better than me." "Foolish remark," he countered with a smirk, "but I'll let it pass. What I want to show you is this." He pointed to a small white speck on the photo. Tuppence squinted, unimpressed. "A scratch on the film, obviously." "Not at all," Tommy declared with mock gravity. "That, Tuppence, is a fairy." "Tommy, you idiot!" She took the magnifying glass he handed her and studied the image. To her amazement, the scratch did, with a generous dose of imagination, resemble a tiny winged creature perched delicately on the fender. "It has wings," she gasped. "Tommy, what fun! A real, live fairy in our flat. Shall we write to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? Maybe she'll even grant us 3 wishes." "Well," Tommy said with a grin, "you've been wishing all afternoon for something exciting to happen. Perhaps the fairy is listening." At that very moment the door swung open, and in stepped Albert, their perpetually theatrical 15-year-old servant. His manner was so exaggeratedly grand that one could hardly tell whether he was attempting to emulate a footman or a page boy. With an air of immense importance, he announced, "Madam, are you at home? The front doorbell has just rung." Tuppence rolled her eyes, half amused and half exasperated. "I do wish Albert wouldn't go to the cinema so often," she muttered, after nodding her assent. "He's clearly been watching too many Long Island butler dramas. Still, I suppose it's better than his old habit of insisting on delivering visitors' cards on a silver salver." Moments later, Albert reappeared and, with the gravitas of announcing royalty, declared, "Mr. Carter." "The chief!" Tommy exclaimed, leaping to his feet in surprise. Tuppence's face broke into a radiant smile as she greeted the tall, gray-haired man with piercing eyes and a tired yet knowing smile. "Mr. Carter, how wonderful to see you." The man inclined his head slightly, his expression faintly amused. "That's good, Mrs. Tommy. Now tell me, how's life? Satisfactory, I hope?" Tuppence's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Satisfactory, yes, but dull. Very dull." Mr. Carter chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Better and better. It seems I've come to the right place. You, Mrs. Tommy, are clearly in just the mood I was hoping for." Tuppence sat up straight, her excitement palpable. "This sounds exciting, Mr. Carter. Do go on." Albert, still in his Long Island butler persona, entered with tea. After completing the task without mishap, a rare achievement, he exited, leaving Tuppence practically bouncing in her seat. "You did mean something exciting, didn't you, Mr. Carter? Are you sending us on a secret mission to darkest Russia, disguised as Bolshevik spies, perhaps?" Mr. Carter shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Not exactly that, Mrs. Tommy, but yes, there is something. And from what I've seen so far, you're just the right people for the job. You're not the type to shy away from risk, are you?" Tuppence's eyes widened, her face alight with anticipation. "Not in the slightest. Tell us more." Mr. Carter reached for the newspaper on the table, turning to the advertisement section. He tapped a small block of text and slid the paper across to Tommy. "Read that," he instructed. Tommy picked up the paper and read aloud. "The International Detective Agency. Theodore Blunt, manager." Tuppence's curiosity was piqued. "And what exactly does that have to do with us?" Mr. Carter leaned in, his voice low and conspiratorial. "That, Mrs. Tommy, is what we're about to find out. But trust me, this is exactly the kind of excitement you've been wishing for." Tommy leaned back in his chair, reading the advertisement once more, his brow furrowing slightly. He glanced up at Mr. Carter, his expression a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "Private inquiries, large staff of confidential and highly skilled agents. Utmost discretion. Consultations free. 118 Halem Street, W.C., he recited. Tommy paused, then looked up. "And what exactly are we supposed to make of this?" Mr. Carter gave a faint, knowing smile. "That detective agency has been on the brink of collapse for quite some time," he explained. "A friend of mine managed to acquire it for next to nothing. We're thinking of giving it a fresh start, a 6-month trial run. But naturally, it needs a manager to run the show." Tommy leaned forward, intrigued. "And you're suggesting me, or, more specifically, us?" Mr. Carter's smile widened slightly. "Quite so. But you won't be Tommy Beresford. For the next 6 months, you'll be Mr. Theodore Blunt, detective extraordinaire." Tommy chuckled, shaking his head. "Mr. Blunt? And what happened to the real Mr. Blunt?" "Well," said Mr. Carter, his tone casual but his eyes sharp, "let's just say Mr. Blunt has been indiscreet. Scotland Yard had to intervene, and he's now enjoying His Majesty's hospitality. Unfortunately, he's been less than cooperative, so we don't know nearly as much as we'd like about some of his dealings." Tommy nodded slowly. "I see, or at least, I think I see." Mr. Carter's voice lowered conspiratorially. "There's one particular detail you need to keep an eye out for. Blue envelopes with Russian stamps. They're supposed to come from a so-called ham merchant looking for his wife, a refugee who arrived in England years ago. Moisten the stamp, and you'll find the number 16 written underneath. Copy the letters, send the originals to me, and if anyone mentions the number 16 directly, contact me immediately." Tommy's curiosity was piqued. "Understood, sir. Anything else?" Mr. Carter picked up his gloves, preparing to leave. "Beyond that, Mr. Blunt, you and Mrs. Mrs. Blunt, have free rein. Run the agency as you see fit. And if I'm not mistaken," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "Mrs. Tommy will find the detective business quite stimulating." As soon as the door closed behind Mr. Carter, Tuppence turned to Tommy, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Did you hear that, Tommy? Free rein. We're detectives now, officially. A new chapter." The detective duo. A few days later, Tommy and Tuppence found themselves settling into their new roles as the heads of the International Detective Agency. Their offices were situated on the second floor of a slightly run-down building in Bloomsbury. Albert, their teenage sidekick, had transitioned from his role as a wannabe butler to a full-fledged office boy. He fully embraced his new character, sporting inky hands, tousled hair, and a perpetual paper bag of sweets tucked into his pocket. His performance was, in a word, flawless. The setup was almost theatrical. The outer office bore the label Clerks, while the inner office carried the more dignified inscription Private. Behind the latter door was a room designed to look as though it had been running high-stakes investigations for years. A massive desk, artistically labeled file folders, all empty, and leather chairs completed the illusion. Tommy sat behind the desk, occasionally picking up the telephone to practice his authoritative voice. Meanwhile, in the adjoining office, Tuppence had her own domain: a typewriter, a less impressive desk, and a small gas ring for making tea. The stage was set, the characters were ready. Everything was perfect, save for one glaring issue: no clients. Tuppence, undeterred by their lack of business, brimmed with enthusiasm. "This is going to be marvelous, Tommy. We'll track down jewel thieves, uncover missing persons, and expose embezzlers. Just imagine the adventures we'll have." Tommy, ever the realist, raised an eyebrow. "Tuppence, you've been reading far too many cheap novels. Let me bring you back to reality. If we get clients at all, there'll be nothing but suspicious husbands and wives looking for divorce evidence. That's the bread and butter of private detectives." Tuppence wrinkled her nose in disgust. "Divorce cases? Ugh, I refuse. We'll set a higher standard for this agency. No divorce work." Tommy sighed. "We'll see how long your high standards last when the rent comes due. The first week, a dose of reality." A week later, their dreams of thrilling cases and international intrigue had taken a nosedive. Tommy slumped in his chair, his frustration evident. 3 women convinced their husbands are sneaking off for weekends. That's all we've had so far. What about you? Any luck while I was out?" Tuppence groaned. "Just a fat old man who suspects his wife is too friendly with the milkman. Honestly, Tommy, I never realized how depressing this business could be until now. I'm sick of saying we don't do divorce cases. Maybe we should just add it to the advertisement and be done with it." Tommy shrugged. "At least we're not completely ignored. Small victories, Tuppence." But Tuppence wasn't ready to give up. "No, Tommy, I refuse to let this agency become a joke. If we don't get an exciting case soon, I'll commit a crime myself just so you can solve it." Tommy chuckled. "How noble. And what, exactly, would that accomplish? You'd end up in court, and I'd spend my days testifying at the Old Bailey instead of running this agency." "Better than doing nothing," Tuppence shot back, her arms crossed defiantly. Tommy leaned back, smirking. "Your optimism is inspiring, Tuppence. Too bad it's based entirely on your belief that we have talent." "Of course we have talent," Tuppence retorted. "I've read every detective novel published in the last decade." "And so have I," Tommy replied. "But somehow I doubt that qualifies us as experts." "Pessimist," Tuppence declared with a dramatic flair. "All we need is one good case to prove ourselves." Tommy sighed, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "All right, Mrs. Blunt, let's see if the universe is kind enough to send us something interesting before we die of boredom." Tommy leaned forward, the polished Mr. Blunt persona slipping seamlessly into place. His piercing gaze was sharp, his tone brisk. "Let's start from the top, shall we? Who is missing? And why do you believe we're the ones to find them?" The young man fidgeted nervously, his hands twisting together as though trying to tie invisible knots. "Well, you see, it's frightfully complicated. I mean, she didn't exactly disappear, not in the dramatic sense, but—" He trailed off, looking utterly lost. Tommy sighed inwardly. This was going to be painful. "Take a breath, old chap. We specialize in delicate matters. Start at the beginning. Who is she?" The client hesitated, his face flushing slightly. "Her name's Marguerite. Well, I mean, that's what she said her name was. I met her at a party last month. She was unbelievable. You know the type. Stunning, mysterious. One of those girls you just can't forget." Tommy nodded slowly, already forming a mental picture. And then, the young man continued, she just vanished. One minute we were laughing and chatting. The next, she was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "You've been looking for her ever since." "Well, yes, but it's not just that. You see, she left behind something, a letter." Tuppence, listening from the adjoining office with bated breath, nearly stopped typing altogether. A letter? Now things were getting interesting. Tommy leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "A letter, you say? What kind of letter?" The young man hesitated again, looking increasingly uncomfortable. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to someone else, a man, and," he broke off, biting his lip. Tommy's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his expression neutral. "Go on. What did the letter say?" "It said something about meeting at a place called The Rendezvous, and mentioned the number 16. Tommy froze. The number 16. His mind snapped back to Mr. Carter's cryptic instructions. Blue letters, Russian stamps, and the number 16. Coincidence? Unlikely. He masked his surprise and kept his tone even. "I see. And you've no idea what this rendezvous might be?" "None at all," the young man admitted. "But the way she wrote it, it seemed urgent. Almost like she was in danger." For a moment there was silence in the room, broken only by the faint clicking of Tuppence's typewriter in the background. Tommy leaned back, steepling his fingers as he studied the man in front of him. "And why not take this to the police?" he asked finally. The young man flushed even deeper. "Oh, I couldn't possibly. The whole thing is far too delicate. You see, Marguerite isn't exactly, she's not from my circle. And if word got out, it would cause an absolute scandal." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. A classic case of a privileged young man getting himself tangled up with a mysterious woman from the wrong side of town. but the mention of 16 still lingered in his mind like a siren call. "Very well," Tommy said at last, his tone brisk and professional. "We'll take the case. But I'll need every detail you can remember about Marguerite. How she looked, how she spoke, where you met her, everything." The young man brightened visibly. "You'll really help me?" "Of course," Tommy said smoothly. "That's what Blunt's Brilliant Detectives is here for, behind the scenes." In the adjoining office, Tuppence was practically vibrating with excitement. She scribbled down notes furiously, her mind racing. A mysterious woman, a cryptic letter, and a scandalous young client. This was exactly the kind of case she had been dreaming of. She barely managed to contain herself until the client left. As soon as the door clicked shut, she burst into Tommy's office, her eyes sparkling. "Tommy, this is it. This is the case that's going to put us on the map." Tommy smirked. "Steady on, Tuppence. The man's clearly a fool, and we don't even know if this Marguerite of his is real." "But the letter, Tommy," Tuppence insisted. "It mentioned the number 16. Don't tell me you think that's a coincidence." Tommy leaned back in his chair, considering. "It's certainly curious, and if there's one thing I've learned in this business, it's that curiosity is usually worth following." Tuppence grinned. "Then it's settled. We're on the case." Tommy sighed, but couldn't help smiling. "All right, Mrs. Blunt, let's see where this rabbit hole leads." Tuppence leaned forward, a subtle but professional smile playing on her lips. "Yes, Mr. St. Vincent, we only employ the finest minds. At Blunt's Brilliant Detectives, results are not just a promise, they're a certainty." Lawrence Street. Vincent blinked, dazzled. "By Jove, that's amazing. I say, Miss Robinson, you're frightfully efficient, aren't you? How do you do it?" Tuppence let the corner of her mouth curve into a knowing smile. "Trade secret, Mr. St. Vincent. But rest assured, if your Janet is out there, we'll find her. Now," she tapped her pencil briskly against the notepad, "before we proceed, let me clarify something. Do you believe foul play is involved? Or do you think this is simply a case of misunderstanding or misadventure?" St. Vincent looked as though his very soul was being examined under a microscope. I don't know, honestly. Janet's a sensible sort. Not the kind to go gallivanting off without telling anyone, but—" He paused, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "She had seemed a little off the last time I saw her." Tuppence's ears perked up. "Off, you say? In what way?" "Well," he said, fidgeting, "she was distracted. Kept looking over her shoulder like she was worried about something. I asked her if anything was wrong, but she brushed it off. Said I was imagining things." Tuppence scribbled a quick note. "Distracted, anxious. Possible outside pressure." She looked up, her expression sympathetic but focused. "Anything else unusual about her behavior? Did she mention anyone, perhaps a person or an event that could have unsettled her?" St. Vincent shook his head helplessly. "No, nothing like that. But, oh, I feel like a complete fool. I should have pressed her harder. Now she's vanished, and I'm left wondering if I could have done something to stop it." Tuppence reached across the desk and placed a reassuring hand on his. "Don't blame yourself, Mr. St. Vincent. You've done the right thing coming to us. Now, let's focus on finding Janet. Time is of the essence." She rose, signaling the end of the consultation. "I'll get started immediately. You'll hear from us by this time tomorrow." As soon as St. Vincent left, Tuppence burst into Tommy's office, her usual calm demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "Tommy, we've got a real one this time." Tommy, who was halfway through a sandwich, raised an eyebrow. "Real one, you say? Not another lovesick puppy?" Tuppence grinned. "Oh, he's lovesick all right. Head over heels for a girl named Janet. Works at a hat shop, disappeared 2 days ago, no warning. But here's the interesting part. She'd been acting strange, like she was scared of something. I've got a feeling there's more to this than a simple runaway romance. Tommy wiped his hands and leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. So, what's your theory? Blackmail? Secret double life? Or maybe she's just avoiding a proposal from dear old Lawrence. Tuppence shot him a withering look. Be serious, Tommy. There's something about this one. Janet pointed out our ad to him herself. She trusted us enough to hint at our involvement if anything ever went wrong. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Tommy nodded slowly. You're right, that is curious. People don't usually recommend detectives unless they've got a reason. Exactly, Tuppence said, her eyes gleaming. So, here's the plan. I'll start with her workplace, Madame Violet's hat shop. If she's as reliable as he says, her co-workers will notice if something's amiss. You, meanwhile, can check her lodgings. Let's see what her landlady knows about her movements. Tommy stood, straightening his tie. Right, and if we don't turn up anything there, we'll widen the net. Let's hope St. Vincent's pockets are as deep as his devotion to Janet. Tuppence chuckled. Oh, I think he'd sell his soul for her at this point. But let's not test that just yet. I'll meet you back here in 2 hours with my findings. The plot thickens. By late afternoon, Tuppence was perched on the edge of Tommy's desk, her notebook open in her lap. So, here's what I got from Madame Violet's, she began. Janet was well liked, quiet, punctual, no enemies. But here's the twist. 2 days before she vanished, a man came into the shop asking for her. Tall, dark, handsome in a brooding sort of way. Sound familiar? Tommy frowned. Not St. Vincent, then. Did this mystery man leave a name? Tuppence shook her head. No name, but he seemed insistent. Left with a hat he didn't even seem interested in buying. Tommy leaned back, considering. And at her lodgings? Same story, Tuppence said. No sign of her, but the landlady mentioned seeing a man lurking near the building around the time she disappeared. Sounds like our brooding hat buyer. Tommy tapped his fingers on the desk, his mind racing. So, we've got Janet, a mystery man, and a lovesick client who doesn't know half as much about his girl as he thinks he does. I'd wager there's a whole other side to Janet we haven't seen yet. Tuppence grinned. Exactly what I was thinking. The question is, what's she hiding? And why does it feel like it's about to land us in the middle of something very messy? Tommy's eyes gleamed with excitement. Messy is good, Tuppence. Messy means interesting. Let's dig deeper. Tomorrow, we pay a visit to that hat shop, and maybe our lurking gentleman will make another appearance. Tuppence hopped off the desk, already reaching for her coat. I'll put Albert on watch duty outside her lodgings tonight. If our mystery man shows up again, he'll spot him. As the two detectives prepared for their next move, one thing was clear. This was no ordinary missing persons case. And for Blunt's brilliant detectives, the game was only just beginning. Tuppence leaned forward, her pencil poised in the air, eyebrows raised. Now, Mr. St. Vincent, let's hear about this young lady. What does she look like? The young man's face brightened, his voice suddenly full of warmth. Oh, she's got the most marvelous hair. Golden, but not just plain golden, you know. It's deeper, like a jolly old sunset on a summer evening. Glorious, really. I've never noticed sunsets before Janet, or poetry, for that matter. She's changed the way I look at the world. Tuppence, unimpressed by the romantic detour, interjected flatly, Red hair? Got it. She jotted it down as if it were a grocery list. What about her height? Oh, tallish, he stammered, waving his hand vaguely. And her eyes, ripping eyes, dark blue, I think. And she's got this decisive way about her. She can take a chap up short, you know, but she's perfect." Tuppence nodded briskly, scribbling a few more notes before snapping her notebook shut. Rising to her feet, she extended her hand. "If you'll return tomorrow at 2 p.m., I believe we'll have some news for you, Mr. St. Vincent. Good morning." The bewildered young man stood up, muttering his thanks before stumbling out of the office. The plot unravels. When Tommy returned from his errand, he found Tuppence absorbed in a book. She looked up, her face alight with a mischievous smile. "Got everything I need," she said confidently. "Lawrence Street." Vincent is no ordinary chap. He's the nephew and heir of the Earl of Cheriton. Imagine the publicity if we solved this case. Blunt's brilliant detectives could be the talk of high society. Tommy raised an eyebrow as he picked up the notes she'd left on his desk. "And what do you actually think happened to the girl?" Tuppence tilted her head, the hint of a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, I think she's done a runner. Classic case. She's in love with him, head over heels, but probably feels she's not worthy or something ridiculous like that. Women in books always do this sort of thing." Tommy frowned. "Books, yes. Real life? Not so much. What if there's something else going on, a scandal, perhaps? Or, what if she's in trouble?" Tuppence waved him off with a laugh. "Relax, Tommy. This isn't a Gothic novel. I'll bet she's holed up somewhere, crying her eyes out, debating whether she should marry him. But," she added, her tone growing smug, "to Mr. St. Vincent I've guaranteed results in 24 hours. Tommy dropped his papers, aghast. "You what? Are you completely mad?" Tuppence grinned, unbothered by his panic. "Oh, don't worry. Mother knows best, Tommy. Leave it to me." Before Tommy could protest further, she breezed out of the room, leaving him to mutter curses about her over-fervent imagination, as he grabbed his coat to follow up on his own leads. The twist. When Tommy returned, tired and frustrated from combing through hospitals for any trace of the missing girl, he found Tuppence calmly extracting a packet of biscuits from a hidden stash. "You look dreadful," she remarked casually, biting into a biscuit. "What have you been up to?" Tommy groaned as he slumped into a chair. "Making the rounds of the hospitals, trying to match her description. And you? Sitting here nibbling biscuits? You can't find this girl single-handed by 2 p.m. tomorrow." Tuppence smirked, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Oh, can't I? Well, lucky for you, I already have." Tommy sat bolt upright. "What? You're joking?" "Not in the slightest," she replied, her tone smug. "Simple deduction, dear Watson, very simple indeed." Tommy's eyes widened. "Where is she, then?" Tuppence grinned, pointing toward the door of her adjoining office. "She's next door, making tea." Tommy gawked at her, utterly floored. "You mean she's been here this whole time? How on earth—" Tuppence leaned back, savoring her triumph. "Oh, Tommy, it's all in the execution. Turns out Madame Violet's hat shop is where I buy my hats, and one of the girls working there, an old hospital pal of mine from the war. We cooked this whole thing up together. She'd plant our advertisement in Young Saint. Vincent's head vanished dramatically, and voila. Publicity for us. A little nudge for him to propose, and Janet gets her happily ever after. Everyone wins." Tommy stared at her, half amused, half horrified. This is the most immoral scheme I've ever heard. You orchestrated this whole thing. You helped this girl snare a man like Lawrence Saint. Vincent?" Tuppence waved his outrage aside. "Don't be so dramatic. Janet's a splendid girl. And if you ask me, she'll be the making of him. That weak-kneed romantic fool needs someone to keep him grounded. She'll whip him into shape. ease him off the cocktails and nightclubs and turn him into a proper country gentleman. Tommy shook his head in disbelief. "You're incorrigible." "Come on," Tuppence said, rising and heading for the door. "Let's meet her." The grand finale. Inside the next office, a tall girl with fiery auburn hair and a kind, pleasant face turned toward them, a steaming kettle in hand. Her smile was warm and natural, revealing a perfect set of white teeth. "Mrs. Beresford," she said, addressing Tuppence, "I hope you don't mind. I thought you might fancy a cup of tea yourself. Many's the time you made tea for me during those long hospital nights." Tuppence smiled warmly. "Tommy, meet my old friend Nurse Smith, better known as Janet. Janet, this is my husband and partner." Tommy extended a hand, still shaking his head in bemusement. "Smith, is it? How curious." "Eh?" Janet blinked, puzzled. "Nothing," Tommy said with a faint grin. "Just a little monograph I've been considering." "Pull yourself together, Tommy," Tuppence quipped as she poured him a cup of tea. Raising her own cup, she declared, "To the success of Blunt's brilliant detectives, may we never know failure." As their cups clinked together, the room filled with laughter, camaraderie, and the promise of many more adventures to come.